All right. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Renelle.
I'm excited that we're gathering today to have a conversation on conscious insights. And you are one of the most insightful people that I know. I've known you since probably 2010 when I got certified in the leadership circle. And I've spent a lot of time working with you and learning from you. And now you have become one of the foremost experts in parts work through your inner team dialogue. So I want to just, just for the listeners, just a little bit about who you are and what you're doing in the world. And then we'll jump into this really important parts work.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm blushing a little bit at that introduction, but thank you. So I'm a coach, and I've been doing coaching since the late 90s. So I go back a long way with this work, and I've been involved in parts work really through that whole time. These two have come together in the last 5 years or so into becoming kind of the main part of what I do, and I've written a book about it. So yeah, I work with individual clients and I work training coaches in this method.
If you guys don't see already, Paul is a pretty humble person. And so when I say that he is an amazing expert, that is actually true. I'm not overstating that. But so Paul, in 2020, I think is when I got a call from you that you were going to take this work and turn it into inner team dialogue, specifically, to really talk to some of our business and organizational clients. So can you tell us a little bit about inner team dialogue and what parts work is?
Yeah, sure. So I was trained back in the mid-90s in a technique called voice dialogue, which is what inner team dialogue is based on. And it's a form of therapy. And I used it in my own personal growth and with my therapist, and probably more than anything else I did in that journey. Or if I look back at kind of the big breakthrough moments, they're almost all was from this work. So I was a huge kind of fan of the work and I just found it incredibly useful. And I'd integrated it all the way through my coaching practice with clients. There's a particular kind of framework that's part of this and a technique. And when I look back a number of years ago about when I felt like my coaching had been most successful, it had this common theme, which was that it involved this kind of parts-based approach. So in essence, there's a lot we could talk for our whole time about what parts work is, but the short version is we feel like because we have like one body and one brain, there's just one of us here. But most people's experience themselves is that we're multiple. We have multiple different parts of who we are, which is why you can say something like, a part of me wants security and a part of me wants adventure. And it makes sense. We know that there are different kind of pulls and drives within us. And so parts work is sort of an umbrella term for a bunch of different forms of work in the sort of therapy and coaching world, all of which help you work with those parts. And so that's the short version of what it is.
So what are some key things that we are seeing? When I got trained in this, it also, I was like, oh, this is such an amazing way to take leaders deeper. And so what are the heavy hitters, what are the key things that we first see with leaders and where people are having kind of the early breakthroughs with this parts work? Can you maybe give an example?
Yeah, so there are a number of, there is almost a limitless number of parts that are any possible way of being human. There's a part that holds that. So there's parts that want us to be liked. There's parts of us that want us to be experts. There's parts that cringe about being called experts. So that's all kinds of different parts and almost a limitless number. But there are certain parts, in the inner team dialogue system, we call them characters because they feel like sort of whole people within us with their own personality, their own agenda. But there are certain parts that occur really frequently with people in leadership roles. So I'll give you just maybe a couple of examples. Would that be helpful?
Yes, that'd be really helpful.
So there's a part called the pusher, which is probably the most visible of all the parts we work with in this system. And the pusher is the part of you that's task-focused, that wants to get stuff done, that wants to move as fast as possible, and that says that your identity is what you produce. And an awful lot of people in the business world are driven by this. This is truly their identity, their sense of worth comes from this. And obviously, there's enormous gifts that come with that. I mean, this is the part that gets you off the couch and gets you doing things and gets things done in the world.
Right.
And so that kind of action orientation and a sense of urgency, it gives you all of that. But any part, for all the gifts that it gives you and all the ways it helps you adapt to the world, if you overuse it out of balance with its opposite, and we can talk more about what it means for a part to have an opposite, then you get overuse power. Any strength overused becomes a liability. So you overuse your pusher, it'll drive you to exhaustion. It doesn't matter how much you do, you think you should have done more. And so I would say 80, 90% of the clients I have in my executive coaching work have a super powerful pusher, and they have a really hard time switching it off. They know they need to, but it'll show up in things like, I can't sleep at night because I'm up thinking about all the things I've got to get done, right? That's what the pusher's focus of attention is. So we do a lot of work around both identifying that so you can recognize that it's driving you, understanding how it served and protects you as a positive influence, and then recognizing how to bring it back into balance with its opposite.
So let's talk about that. My pusher, I affectionately call the overfunctioner. And I sometimes give these personas within me names. And I don't know that the overfunctioner has a name yet, but I will name her soon. Because when I give those parts of me names, I tend to have a little bit more compassion for them. And so let's say there's 80 to 90% of leaders out there have this pusher. Right. What are we finding when we say we want to look at the opposite, and why are we doing that, and how do you do that?
Yeah. So first thing you do is recognize that you have parts, and then you start to identify parts that have a particular kind of influence, like the pusher. Once you've identified what it is, you actually meet the part. So the actual technique of inner team dialogue is, rather than talking about your pusher, you would speak from your pusher. So if I was working with you, I would invite you to fully embody what it's like to be the pusher, not you as a whole, complete, balanced human being, but just this part of you, and have you speak from that. So you give voice to the perspective of the pusher. And then as the coach, I interview that part of you. And there's this fascinating phenomenon is when you just talk to that part, you'll find yourself saying things you didn't know you had to say. And this happens almost every time. And clients are surprised. They come out of these facilitations and go, wait, I had no idea that my pusher started when I was competing with my best friend in 8th grade, right?
Yeah.
So these sort of bits of the history of a part will come out.
So you're doing this interview. And so I've done these interviews and I have been interviewed. And even recently, just doing some work, I wanted, you to interview me. And so what's interesting, right, is that we have, what's this part of us that's talking right now? There's called aware ego, or our inner leader. Right. That's what we call it. So this is like Renelle and Paul talking. And then you ask me, or I would ask you to go into your pusher, and I would literally do something with my body. Whether I get up and then I sit back down and I come back as Renelle's pusher, or you come back as Paul's pusher.
That's right.
And then let's just say you're interviewing me. So you refer back to my inner team, the person you're talking to right now, as Renelle.
Yeah. And so let's just do it for a second.
Yeah, let's do it.
Talk about, but it's really easy when you see it.
Yeah.
So I want you to find that part of you right now that really wants to get stuff done, to be productive, to move fast.
Okay, that's my overfunctioner.
Your overfunctioner. Found it? Okay.
I found it.
Check in with the feeling in your body and just notice what's there.
Yeah. Yeah, my heart starts beating a little faster.
Yeah, I got it. Okay.
Get a little warmer.
So I'd like you as the Renelle's pusher, I'm going to interview you. And if you need to talk about Renelle, you just talk about her in the third person. Okay?
Yeah.
So tell me one thing you do in Renelle's life that helps her be successful.
Well, I really think she needs to get more done. And if she got more done, life would just be easier. And so I have her make 1 million lists. I have her make lists in her phone. I have her make lists by the kitchen. I have her make lists in her notebook. And I also have her put every single thing she does in a calendar, because she might forget, because there is so much to get done in this world.
Right. And what would you be concerned might happen if you weren't there to prompt her to kind of make these lifts and be as productive as she is?
Yeah. Well, I think she'd just forget. I think just the whole thing would fall apart. I
Right.
mean,
So you keep it from falling apart.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't even sometimes I wonder how she could function without me.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, let's call time there. We
All
can
right.
keep going, but that's a flavor of it, right?
So then I come back, and then what would you do as I came back?
So I would ask you about, what did you notice about this part of you? What was new information here? What surprised you about this? So what you end up with when clients go through this, and you've had this experience, is that it gives you a very kind of nuanced self-awareness, because you start to get to know not just yourself as a particular personality type, but the range of different aspects of who you are, because there's this driven part of you, but there's also a part of you that probably doesn't feel an urge to get busy and check off things off your task list, right? We'd also interview that part.
Yeah.
And maybe there's another part that's very relationship focused rather than task focused. We also interview that part. So over time, when you work with meeting these different parts of who you are, you start to recognize that who you are is kind of like a committee of different parts within, all trying to campaign for what they believe is the way to be safe in the world and to be effective. And we call it the inner team. It's a useful metaphor to describe kind of what it feels like inside. And if you've ever had like arguments with yourself or felt the kind of committee in your head, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and so if we were to take the example of me, we don't necessarily have to interview my other part, or we could. You'd ask me, well, what do you feel like the opposite of my overfunctioner, that's my pusher, is? And I think my sense of that would be the reflector, the which is kind of like the beer, the person that just bees, but I call it the reflector and the imaginator, and so we would go we would maybe go talk to that part.
That's right.
And then maybe we would come back and ask some permission from the pusher, because it's usually these protectors that are overshadowing these other sides of us.
That's right. So the opposite of the pusher, which is very much about doing and task, is usually somewhere in the domain of being and reflection. Yeah. And so it's the part of you that likes to sit and stare at the clouds to get inspiration for action, as opposed to just act. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's usually something in that territory around being. People call it different things. I've had people call it grace. I've had people call it rest. I've had people call it the reflector, as you just said. So the name doesn't matter. It's really kind of capturing the feeling of it. And what's lovely about this is you get content. So you get like, what's the rule that this part wants you to follow to be safe in the world? But you also get a somatic experience of it. Like you said, when you went into your protector, like your heart rate starts going faster, which it does with the pusher. Whereas the opposite of that is slower and more inward and calmer and just more chill.
Yeah. I mean, even as we talk about that, and because I'm familiar with the interview process, when we talked about my reflector or my beer, I still feel it in my heart, but it's a slower, and I actually get cooler. So my body feels cooler. And so if we were to probably go into a full interview, I would get a lot cooler.
That's right.
And then we would come back and try to find some balance or harmony between those two. Yeah,
you would. I mean, the one thing that tends to happen a lot is that we across these polarities of opposite aspects of who we are, we tend to strongly identify with one and have some doubt or suspicion or a sense of danger around the opposite. So, for example, people who are really run by their pusher will often think the opposite is lazy. Right?
Yeah.
Actually, it's not about laziness. It's about presence and being purposeful and being intentional. That's not lazy. It just has a different way of operating in the world. Right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of what we do in this work is try and remove the judgments of these opposite parts, which often have been not safe to express. And as you do that and you start to say, okay, well, maybe it's not about being more lazy, it's about being more present, then you reframe it in a really positive way. And then there's integration work, which you can do somatically, and you can do it just an exploration of what would it look like for you to bring a little bit more presence to your action. bring a little bit more sense of being purposeful or intentional to what you do. It gives a new possibility, because you're not talking about shutting off your pusher and never getting anything done. You need your pusher. You're talking about, how do I bring my pusher and this balancing opposite, where I get all the strengths of this part that served me really well over my whole life, plus this sort of moderating influence, which makes the strength actually come out more.
Yeah. And I know when I do the interviews, and when you interview people, one way we somatically integrate is to use these dials. And so one side would be the pusher, and I decide what side that is, and I've got a dial for how much energy. And the other side would be my reflector, and I have a dial. And then we somatically, you ask me to turn it way up and turn it way down, and turn one side way up and way down, and then use the dials to find that middle ground. And so when I do that, that's usually near the end of a session.
Yeah.
What purpose then does that serve when I found, whoa, I think I need I had 90% overfunctioner and 20, or that's not math, and 10% reflector. And I'm realizing I really need it to be like 55, 45. And so then what do I do with that after our session? What do clients do with that if they walk out with that realization?
Yeah, a certain amount of it is, once you've had an experience of an opposite part in your body, it's not just like an idea or something you understand with your head. It's really a whole body experience. Once you've felt that and you've got to know that part's within you, you can reach out to it actively at any time. And part of what you're doing with the volume control is recognizing that actually there's a you, and we call it the inner leader, that's in charge of all these parts, that can say, hey, I got a deadline coming up. I need my pusher right now, and turn the volume way up on just intense task focus. Or, you know what? I'm on vacation. I need to slow down and rest and recover. I'm going to turn the volume way down on pusher and turn it up on being.
Right.
So what you're doing is you're practicing this, and then usually there's an application phase of a session where you might help someone say, okay, so what's an opportunity in the next week where you want to practice bringing both of these in together? What's going to be your process of connecting with them? And then what would it look like in terms of your action in that meeting or in that relationship to be able to bring these forward together? So the action kind of happens naturally. Actually, it doesn't feel forced or fake. It really feels like I can actually let another part of myself come forward that maybe I wouldn't have in the past. So there's this lovely sense of expansion of what's possible, like different choices become available to you. So with being integrating with pusher, a good example of that would be to allow more pauses in the action, to pause and reflect before you go. And just simple things like that, of like, put a beat of pause before you commit to do something.
Right. Yeah. And with me, I get these amazing creative ideas when I slow down and that's why I call it the reflector or the imaginator, because that's some of these amazing ideas. And then I can turn back up the pusher to make some of them happen. Cause it could just sit and imagine all day long too. And then nothing gets done. Yeah.
That would be overuse of the opposite, right?
Yeah.
And so it's always about finding what the right balance is for you in this particular of these different parts of who you are. But you got to know what they are first before you can exercise choice.
Right. And one beautiful way we can just talk to people and access these parts, but there are other ways that we do that, right? Is we're both, we've both been certified for many years in the leadership circle. And so that's an assessment that helps to open the doors for that. The Enneagram is an assessment that helps to open up the doors to potentially see your parts. There's a lot of work in the psychedelic renaissance of people integrating, utilizing parts work. And the notion for many of those is that those more vulnerable sessions that we look at ourselves, it opens up those protector pieces of us, and they're more willing to talk a little bit, as long as they're in a safe, what they feel safe setting. Right? Yeah. What's safe for one person is not safe for another. What would you add? What would you add to that, Paul?
Well, I think that the goal of all forms of parts work, whether it be in the team dialogue we're talking about here, or IFS, or psychosynthesis, there's loads of them out there.
Yeah, IFS is internal family systems.
Internal family systems.
Yeah.
And all of these bodies of work have a similar approach. They all frame things slightly differently, but the core of it is always the same. And the core of it is it's about integration. Mm-hmm. It's about wholeness. It's about how do I take those parts of myself that weren't safe for me to express at some time in my past and reclaim their gifts.
Yeah.
And, so for example, I grew up in a family where it was very safe to be, a peacemaker and keep the peace and maintain harmony. And that was what my role was in my family. I never learned in that environment to be more assertive. So my work in this space has always been about recovering those parts of me that are assertive and directive and clear and challenging. Mm-hmm. And of course, by doing that, it's made me a much more effective coach than I would be if all I was doing was peacemaking.
Right. Yeah.
So it's always about integration. It's always about coming home to more of who you are. And what often happens, what clients will say when they go through a series of inner team dialogue sessions, is that they feel more whole. Like there is a peacefulness actually that kind of emerges as you start to recognize that you're not just your pusher, you also have all these other parts. And there's there's an observer of all these parts that isn't a part and that's really core of who we are.
Right. Exactly. It's always been there. And it's a matter of us bringing that forward. Yeah. I recently did an interview and I let somebody, I asked them, like, what wants to come forward here? And we were doing some integration work, from some journeys that they had done. Yeah. And we talked to brain and then we talked to body. And it was just an incredible conversation about, brain giving body some more room, and brain giving body a couple of, rules to follow, but really giving the body more room. And it was really fun to watch the person as they came back to the inner leader. They came out of the interview of both parts and we integrated them, of just this excitement at trying these new experiments of That's like, right. And it became like, I'm going to try some experiments with this and see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's often how the learning process goes. First, you have to bring something into awareness, and then you have to start to sort of put it into practice in the world. And very often the experiment proves or generates data that it's not what you thought it was. So, for example, when I'm more assertive, it doesn't damage relationships, which is my old story about what would happen. It actually enhances them. Who knew? Yeah. Right? And that's very often the experience people have. So it generates a kind of an informed experiment, and that is an expansive experience. Right. The one thing we haven't talked about that I want to add, because it's really so crucial to this, is that we treat every part as positive. We look at every part appreciatively. And Dick Schwartz from IFS wrote a book called No Bad Parts. And it's such a simple way of capturing this, right? There is no part that's bad. And what this work invites you to do is to step out of judgment of any part and say there's good parts and bad parts. And like my job in life is to magnify the good parts of who I am and rigorously suppress the bad parts, right? What this says is there are no bad parts. Every part is there to try and protect you. Some are overdoing it for various reasons, and you can exercise choice around how much of those parts you bring forward. But there's no bad part, and that kind of compassion to yourself, the opposite of how most people are with themselves, which is self-critical for sure, but sometimes borderline kind of coercive, right? Like people will say to me about, well, how do I get rid of my pusher? It's like, no, you don't want to get rid of your pusher. You need your pusher. It's about how do you moderate your pusher so you get its gifts.
Right. And the more we try to push it away, the more it's going to push forward.
It's a little bit like, the way we deal with some of the parts. It's a little bit like the part activates and says, hey, you're in danger. You need to do these things to be safe, right? And we've tried to try and suppress that. It's a bit like, switching off the smoke alarm without putting out the fire. Right? All these parts will signal you when you're in danger. And so learning how to pay attention to that and listen to that and accept that information, you may not choose to act on it, but to accept the information as useful to you and then be a choice about what you choose to do in the world from that.
Yeah. And it helps you see these parts of your like, oh, this is why this might happen. This is why I might get triggered here. Here's how I start to bring that back to center. And I mean, that's part of the reason that I named some of mine, because it just adds a little bit more compassion to it. I have this other part that is like my inner teenager, and I call her Irritable Isabel. And I love her so much more. Like inner teenager, Irritable Isabel, rather than, this critical side of me. Like that doesn't sound as compassionate as, oh, there's Irritable Isabel is here. What's going on? What's she trying to protect? So, and it just adds the compassion to it. So I love that. Now, Paul, you mentioned No Bad Parts book. You also have a book out, and so if you would talk a little bit about that, because I've been through most of your trainings, I believe, and I think this work is incredible. And as you launch add to the amazing mix of how people can get access to this work. Tell me
the book
about
is
the book.
called Part of Me, which is how people talk about their parts. And part of me wants this, part of me wants that, right? So I just borrowed that language. And what it does is it goes through the sort of framework that we've been talking about here today. What are parts? Where do they come from? How do they work? What do we call them? And then it actually has profiles of 50 parts, the most common ones that you see. So Irritable Isabel in your world, in the book, you're going to be able to see the rebel, right, which is a part most people can identify in themselves, and has an opposite called the rule follower, right, which is another part that's very strong in many people, right? So in the book profiles these pairs of opposites, so 25 pairs of opposites, and then has detailed profiles of a couple of the more important parts. So it gives you a chance to read about them. And again, it doesn't matter what you call them. This book has a particular nomenclature for the parts. You could create your own names, and that's fine. But it gives you a way of introducing it. And what's lovely is when people read this, they're like, how did you know that this is the conversation I have in my head? Well, it's like I've interviewed a lot of pushers and pleasers and responsibles and all these other parts that are in the book. And they all say a lot of the same things. They're like a certain kind of strategy of how to be safe in the world that people find their way to because it works. Yeah. So it becomes quite consistent from person to person. So the book goes into what all those parts are so you can read about them, talks about how they protect you, where they come from, how to bring them into balance with their opposite. And then there's a bunch of exercises and other activities to start to bring a kind of a mindful awareness of these parts within you into your life.
That's awesome. It just gives you somewhere to start, and that you're not alone. Like, oh, other people feel these things too. There's so many times we feel alone, and we're not alone. Many people feel these same things, and this is a way to get us back to wholeness, whether it's through leadership and you're leading in the work world, or just the leadership in your life, your inner leader, as you call it. Like we're bringing back wholeness through this work. And when we bring back wholeness as a human, then our society starts to shift, our organizations, our teams. Yeah.
There's a relationship between inner leadership, how you lead your parts, and outer leadership. So I want to make that explicit because I think it's actually one of the most important reasons to engage with the work.
Yes.
If, for example, I have a very strong pusher, to continue that example, and I judge its opposite as being about lazy, right? And I think that anyone who's not driving at 110% must be a lazy person, right? I mean, there's certainly many leaders in my practice who said that in more or less those words. If I judge the lazy part of myself, I'm going to judge it in other people too. And so at the point where I can say, oh, that's not laziness, that's a pause to be able to be more intentional or purposeful. Actually, that's a good thing. I want more of that. I'm going to react differently when I see those behaviors in other people. Yeah. And so from a leadership point of view, my capacity to lead myself and integrate all these parts and not judge them and see their gifts is a very direct correlation between the degree to which I can do that for myself and the degree to which I can do that for others. So the inner leader drives the outer leader.
Yes, absolutely. And so we're doing this to bring effectiveness and wholeness to ourselves first. And then that reflects in the outside world, whether it's our family, whether it's our team, whether it's our community. And our world really needs that. Really needs that.
Yeah. And there's a funny thing that happens as well, which is that when you're really identified with one part, you'll keep manifesting people in your life who hold the opposite.
Yes.
So funny how many pusher-driven people are surrounded by other people who seem lazy, right? It happens all the time. Or people who are super responsible find people who seem more irresponsible to them, or people who are very focused on pleasing others are surrounded by people who seem very selfish. So we tend to manifest our opposites, and it's kind of like the universe's way of saying to us, giving you another signal that this is available as another way of being. You paying attention yet?
Yes, that's a great thing. It's like, oh, irritable Isabel has been showing up a lot lately. That could mean, that that part of me is out of balance, and I might want to take a look at that. So, yes, I love that. So, this is very deep work. We spend weeks and months exploring this with people. We wanted to give a taste of this because this is such important work. And so, as we conclude with our short conversation here, what are a couple of just key takeaways, Paul?
I think one of them is, start to pay attention when you use the language of parts, which I'm certain you do, because almost everybody does, right? When you hear yourself say a part of me, or I'm in two minds, well, just be curious about what are the two minds that you're in, right? Because they're different parts of who you are. Same when they say a part of me, pay attention to what that part is. And just be open to the possibility that there are other parts of you that you haven't discovered yet. Some of these you can find on your own or by reading about them in the book. Some of them you actually need to be facilitated. They don't feel safe to come out until they have someone that they feel safe with to facilitate them. So sometimes working with a coach around this is very valuable. And that's probably the place I would start.
Yeah.
And then if you want another really concrete place to start, there's actually an assessment that I built called the Inner Team Assessment.
And where can people find that?
They could find it on the Inner Team Dialogue website, and under the resources page. And that's a self-assessment that measures the degree to which you identify with 12 of the most common parts that people identify themselves.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think there's a lot we can discover on our own. And as a coach, and to learn this, I needed to be coached many, many times in this. And so my experience interviewing others and my experience being interviewed, it's a fully different experience, even though I'm fully trained in this work.
Yeah.
To have someone facilitate me through this. I talked that you recently facilitated me through something, and it was just such a powerful experience that I could not have done myself, no matter how much I knew.
I think there's a really deep need that we all have to be witnessed, right? To be seen, to be heard, to be valued just as you are, when nothing needs to change, right? And this work absolutely comes from that place of witnessing your parts that way, as a way of witnessing all of who you are, all the many different colors and flavors of who you are. And I find that incredibly powerful as a recipient of the work. But to be able to be that compassionate witness for other people, there's this beautiful thing that happens that when they experience being witnessed in that way, they start to be able to do that for themselves.
Right.
And, the idea that what this work can contribute is a world in which people are kinder to themselves. I bet you, I'd like to see a little more of that.
Absolutely. I think it has the power to change the world. So, well, Paul, thank you. You are a gift to the world, a gift to me. So thanks. I'm so glad we got to share this. And I will definitely put in the notes of the video how to find you.
Great. Thanks, Renelle.
Thank you.